You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
In Australia, we call them chocos, chocolate soldiers that melt in the sun. Now, I can say that because I've recently made the transition to become one. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about reservists. Those are military forces that are not permanent members of the forces. So think about it like a hobby that you get paid for. And now I say that because I know a lot of my choco mates will get a bit upset with that. So think of it as someone who has a part-time job in the military. But how did reservists come about? Was it different for each nation? What about the British Army reservists? Why is that an interesting tale? I don't actually know the answer, but we might find out soon. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. You're listening to the only podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. And I'm your host, the humblest host you know, Mick. Thank you very much for your iTunes support. It's been brilliant. Actually, we've jumped up the charts. So in some of the bigger nations now, we're in the top 700s, moving into the top 500s in some of them. That's US, UK, and Australia, all big podcast consumers. So it's actually good to get up there because there's over 50,000 podcasts in the world. So it's good to be in the top 1,000 at least. I'm counting it as top 10. But you can help us climb ever so higher by letting your mates know. Thank you also to our Patreon supporters. Your coin keeps the lights on. And I've actually got the lights on in the Dead Prussian studio tonight because I was able to find a guest that didn't make me get up at 4 a.m. Who is that guest? Well, my guest is Dr. Patrick Berry. He is a defence and security expert with comprehensive media experience, which is good. He's a lecturer in defence and strategy at the University of Bath. Now, that's not a place where you learn how to wash yourself. It's actually a place in the UK. And his research expertise includes counterterrorism, military sociology, focusing on reserve service transformation and cohesion, military logistics, yawn, and the conduct of warfare. London-based, Patrick has worked for NATO as an analyst and is a former captain in the British Army's Royal Irish Regiment, the regiment I have worked alongside at a certain point in time. Nice lads there. He has appeared on international British and Irish television. That's right. Ireland has TV these days. And he's also been on radio in all of those as well. His media appearances have been to discuss security issues, including terrorism, current military operations, and military history. Patrick, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure, Mick. Thanks for having us, and great to be in such esteemed company, as I can see.
Yeah, well, I've had some pretty rubbish guests up until now, so you are probably the marquee guest of the moment. And I'm
but now you've fallen through the floor, eh?
That's right. Well, mate, I went to an Irish Catholic school, so actually having someone with a shamrock actually makes the show just worthwhile right now.
It does, yeah, and then obviously, it keeps you protected as well, as you know, from Afghan. So.
Now, Patrick, before we start discussing your book, which is why we're here, I'm actually keen to find out how you got interested in researching war.
In researching war, I suppose good question. It's formed by my own practical experience of being a soldier, and then as I sort of transitioned out of the military and was grappling around trying to work out what I was going to do for my second career, and realized maybe that analysis and sort of private security weren't my bag as such, and looking for a PhD topic. And one of the things I sort of always had in the back of my mind was that difference between when I was in Afghanistan. I served alongside a couple of elite units in the British Army, so the parachute regiment and the Royal Marines. And I started to realize that they had two very different sort of cultures and ways about going things. And I was interested. An essential question was, why was that? And that was what my original PhD proposal was. It was about the sort of difference between elite cultures in the British Army. But between one thing and another, and not really being policy relevant at the time, I ended up going down first the sort of reserve elite units, and then the reserve sort of full on. Just because it was, when you're going around for a PhD topic, you're also interested in what's happening in the policy space, and the culture of elite units wasn't. Let's put it that way. Although maybe it would have been an interesting one to do. So there you go, your listeners. We want to do a PhD, get in touch. Cultures of elite regiments.
And having had to attend working groups with some of those elite regiments, great blokes, really, really top blokes. Now, your book is called Mission Improbable: The Transformation of the British Army Reserve. I mean, that's the book we're talking about today, published by Howgate. Now, can you give our listeners a broad understanding of what your book is about?
I would hope I can anyway. Yeah, the idea of the book essentially was what we had in post 2010 in Britain. You have a period of austerity because of the global financial crisis, and 2012 this starts to really impact on the armed forces in the UK, and so you see, and in particular, although there were some in the RAF and the Navy in terms of losing capability, in particular on the size of the army. And the plan came up, which was for a reform of the army called Army 2020, which was a reduction from about 102,000 down to ultimately about 82,000 over a few iterations of this plan. And at the same time as this, obviously these were controversial politically, and it was all about saving money essentially because of the impact of the recession. And at the same time, coming from a sort of different area of the policy environment and politics, you have the pledge to increase the reserve forces, and in particular the British Army Reserve. So it was about 19,000 strong, and the big plan is to get it up to 30,000 strong. And guess what? Then, if you've got your reserve increased to 30,000, you can say that actually the size of, and I know this is a term they use in Australia, the total force or the whole force, is the same. Yeah, so it was politically expedient in terms of optics. It looked good that, okay, yeah, we're reducing the regular army, but the reserves are taking up the slack. So that was a big change, and this became, it was very controversial for a while. It was sort of one of the central tenets of British defence policy, and hence the book Mission Improbable is about this attempt to grow the Army Reserve, and crucially, because not only was it make it bigger, it was to make it more professional, make it more capable, make it more deployable. So it was making it qualitatively and quantitatively more effective, and the book essentially tells that story.
I love that you used quant and qual as my
mixed methods.
My communications class that I teach at University of Canberra knows that hey, if you're not going for a multidisciplinary approach, I don't want to talk to you. Qual and quant.
Exactly.
Get out of my class, mate.
Absolutely.
So, how did the reserves come about in the first place?
Well, initially, do you mean in terms of the recent policy or the long history of the reserves in Britain?
Give us what you got with the reserves.
Give us what I got. Right, the brain dump on the reserves then is basically, it's got a long history, you can imagine, out of the militia and the volunteers. But essentially the most important point is in terms of the modern era is the 1800s and the threat of a Napoleonic invasion, which sort of creates a panic in Britain, of which the citizenry respond, and especially some of the landed gentry, with creating a volunteer movement to repel any invasion in case they land in England. And as a result of that, that long history through the Boer War and then on into the First and Second World Wars, you see the reserves being used, but basically being called up, becoming more closer to the state and the War Office, and being integrated more into the army, but always being distinctly separate in many respects, especially in the fact that, it's a strategic reserve. It's there for last resort. And unless it is an absolute national emergency and hence mobilization, it's not really going to be used. So goes the idea. And what you saw with this step change, this what we call the Future Reserves 2020 policy of 2013, the step change is essentially, we're going to make our reserve more deployable. We've had to shrink the army And we're going to grow the reserve and make them much more deployable and much more closely integrated with the smaller army components, which of course creates, you can imagine, a whole load of problems, not only in terms of recruitment for the Army Reserve, but also in terms of the training and how they're actually going to deliver this and the readiness,
Yeah.
So it was a step change in how the vision for the reserves had been used in the past. And it was quite bold. It was driven by politics, essentially, and sort of the inter-party dynamics of the Conservative Party at the time. Some strong people in the reserves and also in government, MPs as well, lobbying for this in reinvestment in the reserves. Because one of the interesting things is that the reserves themselves aren't really, and this happens across all forces, Australia to a degree, as far as I know, definitely in the States, France. Reserve forces, because they're slightly periphery and they don't have the political clout, and the best positions in the military are generally not reserved for reservists. Yeah, therefore they don't get the resources to keep them as capable in times of peace, and indeed in times of war. And so you have this a common theme is the neglect of reserve forces by the regulars. And one of the reasons for this sort of in the UK was for this reinvestment and reinvigoration of the reserves. The politicians pointed to was like, the reservists have been neglected. And there were some powerful people there who were pushing for this reserve reform as well. The interesting political dynamic was that the army, faced with its own cuts, was like, we don't want to do this. This doesn't make sense and we don't want to do it. But it's pushed onto the army for political reasons by the Cameron government. And hence they have to sort of run with it, and a plan that they don't see as particularly relevant, or workable. And very interesting for civil military relations, and that period, the sort of the interplay between the chiefs of the staff, especially the army, General Sir Peter Wall, and their political masters about the doability of a reinvigoration of the reserve.
I've once heard it said that reserves are the epitome of civil military relations because they're one and the same in each individual, but that's actually a load of crap. So what about the recruitment efforts and costs? Have they been linked to, you talked a little bit about government policy there, but have they actually been linked to foreign policy objectives, or are they more driven by a domestic strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because you had the SDSR, the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2010, which of course didn't really mention anything about reserves. And then you realise that the cuts coming to the armed forces in the UK are going to be much deeper than they thought, much more traumatic. And the reservist costs, if you're thinking about it this way, a reservist costs between 1/4 to 1/5 in peacetime of a soldier. A little bit more to mobilise in the UK case than a regular, but there's massive savings there to be made if you're looking at this from a treasury perspective. And so, I chart this with a colleague of mine, actually, in an international affairs article about the political dynamics of innovation, and we look at this as a sort of a transformation. There's a whole load of literature out there about how the militaries innovate and transform, and this is what the book is sort of couched in. But I argue that really, although the optics of it and the way it was said was that, okay, this is about cheap scalable mass to face potential threats in the changed strategic environment, and especially with the resurgence of Russia in 2014. Really, if you look at the nitty gritty of it and the drivers of it, it's to do with intra-party politics, and people trying to seed. Basically, Cameron was a fairly weak prime minister at the start of his first tenure, and and he was coerced into doing this, because if he didn't, he was going to get a bloody nose from his backbenchers. There's a whole there's a fascinating Brexit angle here. All the people who were pushing for reserve reform were ended up on the fairly hardline Brexit Tory ministers and stuff. So it was used as a battering ram to sort of make Cameron submit to the will of some of his backbenchers, and he had to give ground, and so he did. And hence you get this sort of politically shaped reserve reform being implemented by a military that doesn't particularly, or the army especially, doesn't particularly want to do it. Yeah. And you can see that's obviously a recipe for great, as the title alludes to, it's obviously a recipe for a great and successful transformation.
Yeah, Sounds like it. It's exact, but it doesn't surprise me. It sounds
No, I'm
exactly how
sure.
governments
Yeah,
work, right? Um,
exactly. It's an interesting read though when you get in. There's a chapter in the book about the politics of it, and you're just like, Jesus H Christ, basically.
and our listeners
But
will read it because they know that they should support our guests and purchase
yeah.
a copy through our
Oh
Amazon
well, there you go.
page as
Yeah,
well. Um,
yeah. Well,
or
well, I mean,
dare I say it, get it from your local library because I'm sure every local
yeah.
library will have a copy of this book.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's loads of them. They're probably overstocked with
Yeah,
it.
that's right. Now you talked about scalability of mass was one of your comments before, and I'm
Yeah.
interested to know how the development of the British Army Reserve has added to the capability of the British forces, and whether or not, based on the reform, how this is going to change, this capability value is going to change for the future.
So I'm going to drop the dirty word here, which is logistics, right? And I'm going to just drop that in there, and people can stop listening now. And hopefully you can track that, right? Where people
We
are
have
just like,
so
"Oh God,
many
we've lost him.
logisticians.
We've lost him.
We
He
have
was
so many
boring before, but now
logisticians
he's."
do it because they like to listen to guests, because half our
Yeah,
guests go, wars are won by
yeah.
logistics, and the other ones go, well, not per se. Sometimes it's material, and you're like, right. So, you're in
So
good
the
company.
real, yeah, if we're talking about capability of this whole plan, like we talked about the numbers and the origins, but if we're talking about the capability, the sort of the where the real crux of it is that they were meant to be more deployable, yeah. And most of it, if you were looking at the Army and as an organization in 2012, where you could actually save money potentially was looking at the hard and the heavy and logistics capability. So in the engineers and the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers and in the logistics corps, right? Because this was stuff, it was Cold War era kit. It's useful if you're going to go, guess what? Actually, it's kind of useful if there's a resurgent Russian threat, but hey, we weren't thinking about that just then. So, it's, and looking at the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, it wasn't really deployed. And it's expensive to keep in peacetime. So a lot of the cuts, the real heavy sort of end of the cuts fell on the REME and the RLC, to save costs. And the idea was, you know what, we can move that kit out to the logistics. But the problem was the logistics didn't have that many units really, RLC or REME. So you create this situation where, right, okay, we've got to grow the reserve and we've also got to change it to be much more logistics and support CSS, basically, combat service support heavy. And that is a profound transformation, because what you end up with, so my research, I went off, hung out with some port and maritime regiment guys who had been driving trucks, and that was their sort of national role, and that's what they did in Iraq in 2003, logistics trucks. And then they were told, no, you're now going to be experts in unloading ships and driving the Mexafloat raft. And you can imagine the problems that creates. So you got a senior staffy, who's done like 20 years, done all his courses all the way up through the grades, and then he's like, okay, now I'm not qualified, or competent to be a senior staff in that role, Meanwhile, you've got your young privates coming through, and they're getting trained up. So you have this sort of disconnect. That was just one of the issues, that you have. So essentially, I ended up looking at on behalf of the Army, they said, would you look at the logistic part of this, because it's so complex and difficult. That's where we think the highest risk is. The infantry bit, the elite bit, that's all okay. They're pretty much swept up. And so I ended up looking at that and then using that, and spent about 3 years hanging out with these units, doing field work, loads of interviews, just to get a sense of how it was going to go and how the change was managed, in terms of how they were sold. What were the models that kind of were underpinning the reserve transformation in terms of the way they think about organization? And was it actually going to deliver capability in the way that it was envisaged? And the idea was by April 2019, so 6 months ago, it was meant to be 30,000 strong and be deployable. I would argue, that's the hard capability side. Really, it's failed to achieve that aim. Now, when you get into the discussion of soft capability, like culture and professionalism, the answer is different, And there you see that actually by drawing closer to the British Army, by having much increased training opportunities, much better deployment, as individuals rather than a sort of collective to train as well. You do see changes happening, and pretty big changes in terms of a rising ethos of professionalism in the Army Reserve. But that's a much more gradual cultural change, and in the long term, maybe actually, as if not more important. But certainly the hard capability, from the evidence I've seen, the hard capability requirements not really going to come up to the plate, as it were.
And so did they get there? I mean, really, wait for our listeners, REME in RLC. So it's Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers and the Royal Logistics Corps, just for those people that aren't familiar with military English. Now, but did they get there in April? Did they make it?
So, good question. As of April, they got to about 27,500, if I remember correctly. So, it's only 10% or less from the target of 30,000. But, when you look into it and you have to delve into the sort of statistics, and it became incredibly controversial. There was a rebellion in Parliament, in the Conservative backbench rebellion about this. So, and the government was forced to release, lots of reports and statistics about reserve recruitment, of which I had the joy of reading, of course, as a PhD in Exeter, probably the only person who was paying any attention at that stage. But the nitty gritty is that the Army Reserve was 19,000 when it started, and much like happens in Afghanistan, where you need to get a result that fits the policy, the metrics were changed. So you saw in Afghanistan, the violence metrics, suddenly when the handovers were happening, what actually counted as an independent action by an Afghan National Army brigade was suddenly dropped, and they all got into the topper tier. Same sort of thing happening in the Army Reserve. What counts as Army Reserve service is changed, and whether they are tier 1 or tier 2 recruits, trained, is changed as well. And this adds about 3,000 at the flick of a pen onto the Army Reserve. So really what's happened in real terms is they've, over 5 years of massive, recruitment effort, essentially balls out recruitment effort, trying to get as many people into the Army Reserve as they can. They've only got about 1,000 a year. And the problem now, of course, is that they've got them in, and the retention is an issue. So the exflow has now increased inflow. So if you look at it from a numbers perspective and a hard capability perspective, no. Are they more deployable? Well, the Chief of the General Staff has actually said, has had to, row backwards on that whole plan to make them more deployable, and said, listen, they're really a strategic reserve. If that's what they're there for, and if they want to do more at an individual level, that's fine. So hard capability, no. But what's interesting is, in terms of maybe in the longer term and more useful, is this soft capability idea, where culture and the professional ethos is gradually being changed and inculcated through integration and exposure to the regulars, more training opportunities, definitely more chances to deploy overseas. So you do see this, change at the more soft capability level, I'd say.
That's a fascinating summary of the transformation of the British Army Reserve. But we're going to move to the bonus question now, because, well, we owe it to the people that pay to keep the power on in this building. So we'll do that, and we'll let all the cheapskates that get the content for free just wait. And we're back now. And my answer, I don't give answers on this show. I'm too scared of giving answers.
Oh, go on.
I don't do interviews. I once had a guest ask me for my definition. They just didn't get it, so I cut it out of the episode.
Okay.
Editorial control is a beautiful thing, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, Patrick, my final question is one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show, to define war in many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish a sentence. The sentence is war is. So right now, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
And I'm going to quote the great Bart Simpson and say, war is hell, man.
War is hell, man. That is excellent. It's something that is dear to our heart. The Simpsons, pre-Disney Simpsons, very, very, very important social commentary. In fact, don't worry about buying Patrick's book, ladies and gentlemen. Go out there and start buying Simpsons DVDs. Season.
I'm just waiting for the T-shirt. I mean, I've loved it since there's actually there is a sticker or there's a graphic of Bart Simpson in a general's uniform with shades on, chewing a piece of straw, and he just says "War is hell, man." And I just want that T-shirt. And
well, you should put it on the cover.
Yeah, I'm not going to do. Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to be able to do better than that, so I'll just stick with him.
That's all right. It's better than half of our guests already, and I know half of them are listeners of the show. I'm talking about the other half.
Good stuff.
Patrick, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's a fascinating topic for those of us in an Army Reserve. And I did like your shout out to the Australian Total Workforce Model working for you. But also how you've managed to draw out, particularly the political, I won't say interference, but the political desires and how that has shaped capability. So thanks very much for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure, Mick. Thanks for having us.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, please support Patrick's work. You can follow him at Twitter, at Patrick Berry, which is pretty much just his name, PatrickBury. You can also support him by going to Amazon through the show notes we've got or on our website and buying his book. He's also got another book out there, Call Sign Hades. Buy that one as well. We didn't get him on to talk about
Buy them all.
we might ask him one day to come back on the show and talk about it because he's had such a blast here. And also, we're pretty hard up for quality guests, so we get whoever we can.
Absolutely. Yeah, the book's only like 10 years old as well, Mick. So
well, that means there's probably still a few copies floating around the library.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gents, please, if you're looking for bonus content, sign on to our Patreon account. You can find the links on our website and our Facebook page, and you may even be able to submit questions that we can ask our guests. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.